you have to just bear with me on that. So I'm going to show you how I do this crease. I don't know how the other guys do their creases. Some guys don't do the crease at all. And that's, that's how they see the glove. But it is, as far as I'm concerned, it is there. And this is, this specific, we were talking just a second ago about what was kind of taught to me with regard to the gloves and the authentic methods. This was never taught to me. This is something I had to figure out on my own, and it just seems to work. So this is Travis's approach to getting the crease. What I'm doing here is I'm taking one of, you've seen these on the floor. I've got two long skirts of solid steel, about, I don't know, 1/3 of an inch in thickness. And I picked these up at a junkyard years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when I was, slowly rebuilding my glove construction supplies to get Crew Gear back up and running and fill out my final orders. And I was lucky enough to find these. And what I'm doing right now is, because again, it's all about keeping the metal as pristine as you can while still applying the details you need. I'm taking a piece of my used sandpaper that I'm not going to use anymore. I've turned it over so I've got the back end laying across the edges here. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to depress this piece of steel into the metal to create that crease. And I'm going to use 2 pieces of steel. So I'm going to grab my other one here, which is giving me a really hard time getting up off the floor. And one's going to be the bed, which I'm going to lay underneath. And the heavier piece, it's a little heavier, a little thicker, is going to be on the top. And what we're going to do is we're going to compress this area right at the hairline of this little Sharpie mark I've made on the top. And by the way, the Sharpie is great because what you can do is, you're thinking, well, you drew on the metal. Yeah, of course I did. Well, what you can do is, to get that off, is simply redraw a little section with the Sharpie. It'll soften up the ink and you can wipe it right off with your finger, and then the rest of the procedures with the color will take that off. You won't even see it. But this is really delicate. And it's one of those things where you get, you can make a bit of a goof, but you really can't goof this up too much. If you screw it up, you screw it up, and there's really no recovering from it. So I really hate this part of the process. It's my least favorite to do. One of my least favorite parts to do. And this is why it's important. You saw me tapping the piece. Why it needs to lay completely, uniform and flat, and not be buckling up in any weird way. When I was tapping the top, and I would adjust it so it's laying perfectly flat and symmetrical, because you want a very sturdy bracing point when you do this. And I'm just taping this off a little bit here so we have full coverage and it stays steady, this little piece of sandpaper. And remember, this is on about a 5-degree tilt. It's not completely flat across, although it's funny, even when you do it on the tilt, in some sections it looks, when it's on the back plate and bolted, it does look straight, but it's not. You'll see me actually cant the angle here when I do this. So I'm measuring it, I'm laying it down, I'm making sure everything is straight, and then I'm going to just gently, there you go, I'm canting the angle slightly. And this is how I do it. Brute force. I'm on top now, and I am going to push this down in one motion. There we go. And I'm holding it very sturdy, because now I have to get on with my knee to hold it, in place, so it doesn't move around too much. You really don't want it moving around a lot, but if it does, you can still work with it. And once you make that depression increase I just did, the actual line will drop below the mark you made. And you see me just hammering it once. I hammered it really quickly, and now I'm going to give it just the slightest tweak up and down, and that created the indent point. And it's very subtle. It by nature lies about an eighth and a half below the mark. Even though you put the depression point on the mark, it slides down when you do the depression. You can see me just doing a slight adjustment, which I only recommend to people who have done this a few times and really get comfortable with the procedure. And we're going to go ahead and repeat that now on the second index. Here we go. A lot of comparison, a lot of repeat motions, a lot of physical torquing. All these little incremental changes I'm making are as subtle as they can be, and you're going to see me doing something that is a bit obsessive, but it's the only way that I can really get the consistency that I seek as I'm building. And that is constant flipping, replacing, comparing, switching of angles, switching of views of the pieces that I'm working on, from the two copy pieces of the index to the DESA. Constantly reverting back to the previous copy to look at what's going on. And what I'll then do when I'm comfortable is I want to get a feel for what's going on. It's also about the feel, so I'm not actually doing anything to this piece, but I'm placing my tool, the magic tool, on the spots that I'm going to be working on to get a feel for where they are, to get a balance, and then when I'm comfortable that I know the feel and where it is, I'll go ahead and apply it. And I do this for every small section of these pieces, pretty much. And as I get more comfortable, you'll see this actually speed up, and I get actually very, very quick on certain spots, but the first parts are always a little bit slower. And then I'll go ahead and compare and see how I did. And although I wait till the end to start really refining, sometimes I'll go ahead and I'll refine certain spots. So again, here I'm testing. I'm not actually torquing this. I'm just kind of getting a feel for the metal, seeing how this, you know, relays to, you know, my sense of extremes and you know, the breaking point, as it were, of where I need to stop, and I go ahead and I juxtapose that and I give that pressure, that perceived pressure, to the piece that I'm working on. So the first two made dents have been made, and you know, yes, I'm showing it to the camera, but I'm also looking at it. This is not just to demonstrate. This is, you know, this is actually me working, and I'm shifting it again under the light, under the reflection, tilting, banking, angling, whatever you want to call it. And you know, yeah, it's obsessive, and yeah, I spent a lot of time on it. But this is the only way to get this to this. Okay. Yeah. This was getting too long. I had to do something to lighten the mood a little bit, as not to seem, you know, overly narcissistic with this whole thing. I'm sure there will be a few more surprises, and here we go. Continuing on as I show you what's going on, and we've just panned down from, obviously, the index knuckle to this pair here, the DESA, and I'm using my camera light, so it's really blown out, but I wanted to show some of the detail. I've actually gone ahead on this second index knuckle next to the DESA and moved forward a bit with the shaping. The shaping is more involved than the other piece, and I'll show you in a second what I mean by that. I went ahead and fast-tracked a little bit just to kind of get myself going and show a little bit of the differences between the two. So yeah, as the text indicated, going to be showing you now. These knuckles have not yet been completed, but we're going to be completing them pretty quickly. Because remember, I told you I would tell you how I do it, and I take my thumb under these knit gloves and I simply depress it. And because I've created all those shapes pretty firmly, they all go down pretty uniformly. And they're still going to calm down even more once I start adding the weathering to these. Because again, this is, you know, you can see a lot of the oils have really picked up on the sheen. The reflections are pretty high at this point. It's still matte, but it's a little shinier at this point because of all the oils that we talked about, getting into the metal, working it, you know, itself into the surface. And it's still very bare. It's still very pristine metal, you know. it's the caramel. My light in the camera is blowing out the true nature of it, but it's still representative, and it's just very, very pristine. I'm showing you these sides for a reason. I'm going to get into it in just a second. So that is going to, the surface is going to calm down a bit once I apply the next portion of the color, which is kind of why I wanted to do it. Remember, these are virtually now identical to this DESA, except for the point I'm now showing you. Look at this underside. This has one single arc. This has a bit of a flat indent right there. I've got to go ahead and create that now, because as good as my templates are, again, I'm hand cutting these, and yes, there's always going to be discrepancies, but I really try to get those discrepancies to a bare minimum. Now on this side, it's a very similar situation. You can see the DESA on the bottom. It's a little bit rounder. It has a bit, like almost like a dip, and this one is a little bit straighter across, and that's because I have to alter that bottom piece just a bit. And this is where the 5% comes in. Everything else on these are finished. I have to now go, well, actually, no, that's not true. I have to now go in and do the last bit of fine detailing, and this is where I kind of go the extra 9 yards and try to pick up the last minute details, if possible. And I say if possible because what I do is on my templates, which is why even if I showed you my templates, you would still need to know this. And this is the trick that I was going to, I was debating as to whether I was going to tell you. It looks like I'm going to tell you. So the trick that I do is coming up very, very shortly. And it's got to be done very carefully. I've had several accidents while doing it. Wrecked a lot of metal until I really got the knack of doing it. First time I did it, I nailed it, and then I got a little lazy. And you really have to really be vigilant when you do this trick. But it will afford you, it will create a bit of a dilemma, which you'll have to then kind of repair. But it's a minor thing, and I'll show you how to do it. And it's one of those, it's one of those things that's going to create a freak out moment in your head, I'm sure. It's a minor maneuver, depending on where you're at. I leave certain, here's the deal, I leave certain sections, I give myself a little bit extra wiggle room, rather than leave myself not enough to play with, because of those inconsistencies when you're working with metal. And I like to make sure at certain sections on this, and I keep in mind for each piece where those sections are, that I know I'm going to want a little bit of wiggle room to play with when I'm done shaping. And we're going to show you that in just a second as I finish off these knuckles. And then we're going to give you a sneak peek at the Stage 4 color application. I won't be talking about the actual application itself at this point, but I'm going to show you the result, because I think it's important to start really visually seeing this in its representative form. But right now I'm just kind of testing it out visually. I'm just, this is just, it's all about the big picture, guys. And you'll have to excuse my voice because it's going again. Fighting off yet another cold. It's all about the visual big picture for me. And at various points, I have to, it's why you'll see this glove assembled, disassembled, assembled, disassembled. I will go to the extent to where at certain points when I'm building a glove, I'll have, my reference pieces, and I'll put them in their spots on a back plate just to get a feel for it, and I'll compare the glove next to it to make sure it's laying right, because it's about how it lays. It's about how the degree of pitch and yaw of a certain piece. Did I get it right? Because until you kind of get it on the back plate, even at that point, you really can't tell. So it's a lot of tedious testing, before I am finally comfortable to go ahead and bolt these suckers down and then actually test the mobility. And then we all know I do the mobility tests, and that's a whole other, adjustment period, minor adjustments. So it's constant minor tweaks and adjustments to get this thing right, for me, anyway. So that's what we're doing right now, and I'm going to get ready to give it, I think, one more fit test, and I'm going to get into a little bit of the color. And when I do the color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best to just do a good solid cross dissolve. I'll mark off a spot on the floor, and you know, so I can do like a real, like, you know, A to B dissolve, and you can really see the shift. And I'll keep it next to, I'm only going to do one. I'm not going to do both of them, and I think that's good because throughout the rest of this, it'll be a reminder to us to what our goal is, our end goal in the color. And again, I mean, it's, you know, it's like a visual update almost, you know, for people who wait for things. God. You know, it's like, you know, here, have a look. This is where it's going. You know, you got to keep those things in the forefront. You got to give people something to believe in and something to you know, look forward to. And although this looks really cool, and you know, it's a far cry from what it was when I first bent these out. I really want to keep giving more and more and more towards, you know, the run up to the end of this process. And so that's what this next section is about, as I finish up these two index knuckles and wrap the color and proceed then to the middle. And again, I promise, the rest of these sections are not going to be that, you know, as long as this one was. This one really, really went the distance, but it was really important because now you have all of the, you know, basic information on how to get these, you know, these down, and if I haven't talked about a section on them, just take a look, like the sides and the little dents and buckles. They're all there. I've mentioned them enough. Like I said, I'm not going to give you everything, but I'm probably going to show it to you. So it's here, guys. It's all here. And on that note, let's take a look at the trick that I didn't even know I was going to show you, of how we make that final adjustment to finish the index knuckles. And how is that? What is that trick, you ask? Yep, this is how I did it. This section is going to be really, really long, and it's going to afford me a little bit of time to discuss the final details of the final details. I think this is really important because, like I said, the other segments you're not going to get nearly as much introspective or commentary or visual demonstration on. I'm including this long lead-up process on the index knuckles for the Part 2, the two Part 2 copies I'm making from the DESA Becker clone 2.0. Because the subsequent sections, at least of the knuckles, are not going to have this lead-up. I'll probably do an extended lead-up of the tips on the index tip as well. But we're going to, while I'll include various shots of what I'm doing, and I'm not going to skip out on anything, it's going to be a different approach for the rest of the pieces once this section is done. So I'm going to get us going here and talk a little bit about the process, and then I'm going to get into, I think, some more in-depth commentary as this runs. I'm not going to do any cross dissolves on this section. The camera, you know, I've watched it already, so the camera is going to go blurry in and out. You're not always going to see the fine detail until I pull it up into camera, because I'm kind of, you know, at one point I'm looking at it for myself, and when I remember to, I'll show it to the camera because I know I'm going to be doing commentary on it later. So you might not see all the fine detailing as I'm comparing, but on the whole, if you watch this whole section and really pay close attention, and it also helps, frankly, not to blow this up into your full resolution. It helps to watch it on the YouTube size because my camera is such shit. You get more detail if it's viewed a little bit smaller. So, and again, you know, this isn't a full-on diagram of how to do all this. I'm showing you, but I'm not giving you, you know, real dimensions on this stuff. I mean, it's certainly here. I'm eyeballing this. You know, I don't do measurements until the end. And that's just because, A, I've done this for a while now, and B, I'm an artist, so I have that kind of discerning eye, and I can tell pretty closely. I make the odd error, but I can tell pretty closely in terms of dimensions and scale and such. But really, at the end of the day, I just know these pieces, and I know where they need to kind of fall and lay. And so I'm not doing a lot of actual physical measuring with a ruler per se. But what I am doing is creating, using the wiggle room that I left myself. That is to say, the extra footage of metal, or the extra increments, millimeters, whatever you want to call it. I left myself some wiggle room toward the bottom. I generally don't leave it toward the top portion of these tips where it starts curving down into the fantail. But around the middle axis of this piece, I leave myself a good extra 1.5 millimeters wiggle room. And before I go into why, let's take a look at what's going on here. I just started this process of grinding down the sides, and you saw it leaves an overlap shelf, a metal shelf. That's the ground down metal. And this is why I grind these from the bottom up. I grind these upside down. I don't grind them going down because I have to be able to see the contours when I do this process, which is the repair process. I have to cut this stuff off. Now, this is really delicate. It is by its nature inherently going to leave some very fine toothing. I'm taking my large metal shears and very gently, and you have to really get in and feel where the separation is between the actual metal and the ground out throwaway grit is. And you have to cut that off. And you really run the risk of, when you do this, if you cut too close to the metal in that seam, you can really, really fuck the metal up. And even then, there's a repair that you can do, but it gets, you don't want to muck with the metal too much. You really don't want to damage it. So it's a very, very delicate process. And you saw once I do that, I then go in and sand it down. Again, this is where copper is great because it's so forgiving. It really is. By the time I'm done with this thing, and this is when I said, you might have a freak out moment. It's okay. Like every other aspect so far of this documentary, I've always said, don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. And in the end, it always is. Well, trust me once more. By the time I'm done with this and the sanding and the shaping and everything else, you're not going to be able to tell I ground down anything. It's going to look perfectly uniform to the rest of the piece that was cut. It's going to be soft and supple, and any toothing is going to be minute and really visible only under a microscope. So don't worry about it. But this is, again, another long process. So it's increments. It's all incremental. Constant comparing. And this is where you're really going to see a lot of the comparing of the two pieces is almost equal to the time I'm spending, if not substantially more, now that I recall watching this a little while ago for this and thinking about what I was going to say, than the actual grinding itself. So it's increments. Now this section is only going to focus, until I say otherwise, on the left side. That is, the side facing us right now is the only section I'm going to be working on. Now, say goodbye to the index knuckle. Goodbye. And move on to the bane of my existence. Even though the index is more difficult, the middle. And we will see you then. Welcome back, everybody. It's not 10,000 years later. But I thought that would be a fun little intro because this seems to have taken about 10,000 years. Alright, so it's me, it's Travis, we're back. And we're going to talk a little bit about this next section of segment 6, which will be focusing on the middle knuckle. Now, before we get into that, I want to do a bit of a recap on the work that's been done to the index. And, I promised I would touch on quite a few aspects of this glove, from stem to stern, as I go through this process, and to be sure, that promise was steadfast. I'm going to be doing that. Where and when, I honestly couldn't tell you. But for the time being, what I will be telling you about is some of the things that you may be, again, thinking in the back of your mind. And these are things that I've thought about through the process of me building these things. Specifically with me reverse engineering the DESA Becker clone and transferring it into what will be, this will be my first two, this is my first part 2 copy of that particular mother glove. So you're along for the ride as much as I am to see if I get this right. Seems to be shaping up pretty well so far. So this is like a twisted Mr. Rogers, right? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Won't you be mine? Won't you be mine? Anyway, I should put Mr. Rogers music over this. Maybe I will. Yeah. So I promised, some information on something that I talked about, which are the differences between why I built the DESA Becker clone, the differences between the part 1 and the part 2. And so far I really haven't touched on that, but I'm going to start right now. And some of those differences are up to, again, points of conjecture, up to my opinion, not based in fact, based on my observation only, and taken with a grain of salt, really, at all times. Okay. And, fuck. I got a gimped out rivet. Alright. Yeah, that's not going to do well. No, that's not going to suffice. Alright, we got to pop that fucker off. Excuse me one sec. Alright, so, as I was saying, I'm going to start touching on some of the differences from how I see it. And it's important to note that there's going to be a section in this documentary eventually where I talk about all the differences between what I've kind of come to grips with, my opinion on the changes that the glove has gone through between both productions and between the scenes in each production. Some are really well-known public domain facts, some aren't. And, always take what I say with that grain of salt. It's the best advice I can give you. Other than popping on a rivet really carefully. So this is the first hand fit. Let's see how we did. Alright. Not bad. Not bad at all. It's got some colour, yeah? Alright, so, and, again, I don't have these rivets bolted in. They're just kind of laying there, but I did bolt it to the back plate. So, let's get all these fuckers into their spots. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Much better. Now, some of the differences I want to talk about on this glove. And we'll address this as we leave the part 2 index behind in the dust with a mighty Hio silver. I've got it bolted really tight. It rests because it's got to have this. Let me get closer for you guys. It's got to be able to do this. It's got to be able to turn on its axis a little bit on the back plate. You know what I mean? It doesn't just lay flat because you've got that curvature down there. So I actually bolted it a little bit too tight, but that's just because I have one of my temp rivets on here. So, but for all intents and purposes, we're good. We're good to go. So there you go. And what I want to tell you about what I've kind of come to grips with on this is that in a lot of the periodicals, across the board, when I say periodicals, I mean the production stills of the period of part 2. Specifically, we're talking about that. This little bastard tends to do interesting things, and I kind of touched on it before. Depending on the scene in the movie, it seems, depending on the pose, depending on, who knows, maybe just the malleability of the metal. This tends to kick up and down. I mentioned this before at some point in the documentary. You'll see shots of this glove where this knuckle flat, you can see it is on an angle. It's on about a 4, maybe 3 or 4 degree incline. And that is, from what I can tell, this is the Becker clone. So I matched it to the Becker glove. Now, if I were to start saying, well, I really want to match it to part 2, we start talking about, as far as I'm concerned, scenes. We start talking about parts of the movie or what your favorite reference point is. In terms of, let me give you a really good example. When, I don't want to name the character. When the kid from part 2, there's this great shot of him with the glove kind of like this, in the shower and you've got the back plate all wide. And I say the back plate all wide because that's a back plate issue we're going to be talking about. That back plate does not appear like that in any other portion of that movie except that shower sequence, flattened out and wide. I'm going to touch on that a lot later in this documentary, not right now. But it's a good example of where something can shift and lay differently from a visual standpoint. And depending on the periodical that you look at, the production still that you look at, this flat can really be kicked up that way or really straightened down. And I mentioned this, it does tweak. Even shots with Robert wearing it, he'll be totally splaying it out and it'll be totally kicked back. And then in other parts it's much more refined as it is here. So really, when we're matching the part 2, we're talking in terms of our favorite visage of the glove from either the film or the periodicals or both combined. I haven't really decided where I'm going to go with that yet. I haven't decided, because this is the first one I'm doing, what I see. And it's such a minor degree. It may come down to me really just bending this up 2 degrees if I decide to do it and match a certain, pose. I've got to find my favorite. And I have an inclination as to a couple of them, it's really hot in here, that I'm probably going to use. Right now I'm not going to worry about it. As I said, once I get it on the hand and bolted and braced, there are going to be minor modifications, pitch, yaw, torque, and final adjustments, and that's what those final adjustments are going to be. So for right now, I'm just matching up the Becker clone and giving it we'll be giving it obviously the part 2 weathering and all that kind of stuff. But certainly when we start getting into the discussion on the back plate, this conversation is going to be revisited. For right now, we are just assuming that we all are in line, that this is going to be a part 2, and that those little fine details are not going to be addressed until the complete glove is built. And they're there's like 1, 2, there's really like 3 details that make this the part 2 versus, aside from the weathering, that make this the part 2 versus making it a part 1 or a Becker clone. Because in my opinion, the Becker clone is actually closer in those like 3 details to the part 1 was, and prima facie evidence of that is somebody having bent back the pinky blade into its straight position. Who knows who had it for 20 years? If I had it, I would probably want to restore it to how it was in part 1, because I'm an idiot. I would wreck the thing, wreck its value. I'd probably refinish it. I'd fuck it up, and maybe somebody did that. Who knows? Just kind of the things that I see. So we're going to be addressing that later, but right now let's get back into the build process, because this is going to take probably another 10,000 years as we get to the middle knuckle of the DESA Part 2 Kruger.com razor glove. And thanks for your attention, and I hope you're enjoying it. We'll see you in a little while.
All right, now that the index has been adjusted on the right-hand side, we're going to close out this section. I'm going to do what I'm going to do for all of the pieces on this glove, and we will do a final sweep around, recap, and give you some shots for reference, held shots. But right now I'm just showing you the second fast track piece. We've already seen the aged piece, but I'm going to give you a peek at something in just a second. Placed on the back plate, looks pretty good. Right side looks great, fix that up. I also replaced my bulbs in the studio, so I have a bit better lighting now. They are the reveal bulbs, the quote-unquote natural daylight bulbs, but they're still just over the counter. But this is a sneak peek at one of my other test pieces. It's a test index for the Part 1 weathering procedure. This is what I use as a gauge on all my Part 1 pieces, and they range from this severe to less severe on both the tips and the knuckles, but this is my all-in-all test piece. I thought you'd like to get a peek at that, as you never know what's going to stick up or pop up in this little documentary. But here you go. Here are the reference shots. I'm going to do some turnarounds for you guys. Please, if you feel like they're adequate to do so, screen grab. Take a look as we revolve the index piece around for the purposes of reference for any of the glove guys, new or old, that has an interest in my take on the process. And, you know, as I've said many times throughout this documentary, I'm going to give you just about everything, but I'm not going to give you everything. So the only thing I'm not going to show you is the bottom. I'm not going to show you the bottom. You can see for yourself kind of what's going on, and I'll leave you that little, 25% to figure out on your own, but I'll give you everything else. And you're losing, some of the definition and some of the edges here because of the light drop-off, but you should be able to juxtapose kind of what's going on if you compare everything that's been shot so far. And hopefully this will be a help to you guys, and hopefully you find it interesting. Hopefully the journey through this long process has afforded you some insight into how I tackle not just this index piece, but all the upcoming pieces. But I will include this last bit on all of the pieces of the glove, and that goes from the back plate to the blades. So we'll do as complete a recap as we can, and now we'll move on to the middle knuckle fabrication and shaping.